Good evening, everyone. My name is David from ExamPal. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today. Before we get started, I would just like to make sure that everyone can hear me properly. So please take a second to just go ahead and type into the chat box on the right side of your screen. Yes, David, we can hear you. All right, perfect. So we are going to wait another minute or two just in case there's a few latecomers who have not shown up yet and who will hopefully show up in another minute or two. In the meanwhile, I do like to make these webinars as interactive as possible. So if there's something specific that you would like to hear about today, please type this in to the chat box and I'll try to gear the webinar towards you. Someone's asking, is there video as well? No, there is not video. This is just an audio webinar. You should, however, see a PowerPoint presentation which will guide us throughout the entire talk on your screen. So if you can't see, then please check your connections. Can everyone else see? Can you see the big welcome screen that says GMAT Time Management Hacks on the screen? Okay, perfect. So how many here have taken the GMAT before? For how many of you is this a retake? For how many of you is this your first time ever doing the GMAT? Oh, wow. Okay, we got a bunch of first timers. I see we have a bunch of retakers, a few retakers as well. That's really good. That's really good. It's a good mix of people. The webinar is good for everyone. Everyone can benefit from the things in this webinar. But it's always nice to see that there's a mixed crowd. All right, I think we've waited long enough for the webinar. For the latecomers, this webinar is recorded and sent out to you via email afterwards. So if you do, for some reason, happen to miss some of it, if you drop out or something like that, then you will be able to make up what you have missed. So as I said, my name is David. I'm a senior tutor at ExamPal. I've been in the business for a few years. Before we get started, as a thank you to everyone who is with us here today, there's a special sale for the next 48 hours. You can just go check it out and see what it's all about. So how is this webinar going to start? We're not actually going to start by talking about the time management. We're going to start by talking about the GMAT. And this is especially important for those newcomers amongst you who have not taken the exam before. And what I aim to show in the first part, say 10 minutes or so of this talk, is how you should go about studying for the GMAT, what the most important things to do are, and what you shouldn't be doing. And what this guy right here in front of you is doing right now, which is banging his head up against the wall against thousands and thousands of problems, is exactly the wrong way to study for the GMAT. All right, the GMAT is not about rote memorization. It's about developing a skill that we call cognitive flexibility. And the next few slides are going to aim to explain what that is. So ExamPal, basically us, we're a bunch of teachers essentially built up the company. And we found in our standard sort of brick and mortar frontal course type courses that there's a few big problems with GMAT courses today. One big problem is that there are 10 different ways. There's many different ways to solve every single question on the GMAT. And when I stand in front of class and I teach 40 students, then I really have a big problem explaining to every single student the right way that works for them. And this goes the other way around. When you're studying for the GMAT, you shouldn't just be learning the material. You should also be focusing in on which way works best for you. The second really big problem with one-size-fits-all type courses is time. The hardest part of the GMAT isn't actually answering all of the questions, it's answering them on time. So if you had 5 minutes or say even 10 minutes, you could to answer every single question and you're sitting in comfort on your living room or wherever, then you could answer every single question on the GMAT and you could get them all right. Unfortunately, you don't. You have approximately 2 minutes per question, and you not only need to know how to solve a question, you need to know how to do it quickly, under time pressure and under usually severe doubts of confidence. If this is something that's very important to you, you don't want to screw it up. And so what this all came together for us as is that many of our students were just wasting a bunch of time, and they're wasting a bunch of money as well, because these courses are often very expensive, on going through thousands and thousands of questions and trying to do something that's just the wrong way for them. Basically, they were doing what this guy over here is doing. All right. And what we did is we set up a course which circumvents this. And our course is online. And this is also the way that we recommend that you study. We recommend that you study online. We recommend that you have access to a bunch of different ways to solve every single question, and that you focus in on those specific methods that works quickly and well for you. So this is the general approach to studying for the GMAT. And it can be summarized as cognitive flexibility. And the analogy I like to use is that you're walking into the test and you have in your hands this really, really big toolbox. And this toolbox has a bunch of different tools in it. All right, it has equation manipulation, it has using numbers, it has various properties of integers, it has positive and negative properties, it has all sorts of things, it has vocabulary, it has grammar rules, it has the different types of traps that you can see. These are all different tools that you can use in order to solve a given question. And what you need to do is figure out which of these tools you like and use those, and which of these tools gives you problems. And there you need to be a little bit more careful. All right, and that was a little bit of theory, and just to sort of drive it home to, in practice, show you what this means, I'm going to put a question up here on the board. I want you to go ahead and solve this question. So take, 20, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, minute and a half to solve the question, and type into chat the answer. And I don't actually care so much what the right answer is. What I want you to type into chat is how you would go about solving this question. All right, so just go ahead and read it. For every positive x and y, 3x plus 2y divided by x plus y is between, and then you have options A to E. And go ahead and type into chat, A, what you think the answer is, and B, why you think that is the answer, how you would go about solving this question. All right? Not just the answer, also why you think that is the answer. How did you solve this question? Perfect. All right. So, and what I want you to do now is, for those of you who've solved it, great. For those of you who are typing it, keep on typing. I want you to look into chat, and I want you to see the different types of answers that people have put in order to solve this question. And when I'm talking about your cognitive flexibility, which is to say your toolbox, this is what I'm talking about. You're seeing some people are plugging in, some people are doing some kind of equation manipulation. Some are saying that it's 2 on one side and 3 on the other side. Every single person had a different approach in order to answer this question. And that's great. That's exactly how people work. We each see the world a little bit differently, and we each solve problems a little bit differently. And so what we've done in order to sort of make our course personalized, and again, this is what I recommend that you do in your studies, is that you learn to categorize the different types of approaches, and you learn which type of approach works best for you. All right, so I'm going to go through 3 different answers to this question. The first type of answer, which we like to call a precise type of answer, is similar to what some of you have written. It's basically some form of equation manipulation. All right, and in this case, the type of the specific solution that I've put up on the board is that if you add x to the if you add y to the numerator, then what you have is 3x plus 3y, and then you can cancel out x plus y and you get 3. If you subtract x from the numerator, you get 2x plus 2y. You can divide that by x plus y, and you get 2. And therefore, our expression is between 2 and 3, right? You add you add y, or you subtract x, you get something that is between 2 and 3. So this is great. But some people look at this and they go, what? I mean, how on earth am I supposed to look at this original fraction and think to myself, do I add a y? Do I subtract x? Like, where does this mathematical intuition come from? And for some of you, that's just the wrong way to go about it. And in this case, a completely different strategy for solving the question is not even to bother trying to figure out exactly how to solve it. Instead, as some people have said, all you can do is plug in a simple number. So for example, if we take x equals y equals 1, then the fraction simplifies into 3 plus 2 divided by 2, which is 2.5. That means that A is impossible, B is impossible, C is impossible, E is impossible, so only D works, and therefore D has to be an answer. And this is a completely different type of solution strategy, which is what we call an alternative, and it's essentially a way to get to the right answer without actually understanding why that answer is correct. And these types of tools are great for essentially solving questions that you just don't know what to do with, or you don't have a good intuition for what to do with. A third type of solution approach, which is also hinted at in by some people in the chat, is something that we like to call a logical approach. And these types of approaches are fundamentally based on understanding the properties, sort of, let's call it the maybe deep mathematical logic, and in quant and verbal, sorry, there's also a logical type of approach, which is a little bit different, but it's based on understanding what's going on in the question, on seeing the big picture. And in this case, the big picture of this question is that we're looking at something like a weighted average. So 3x plus 2y, it's going to be some kind of a mix of x's and y's. And so if you had only x's, if the y's were very, very close to 0, and you could choose whatever number you wanted for x, then the expression would simplify to 3x over x, which is just 3. On the other hand, if you had only y's in the expression, then what you would simplify, your expression would simplify into 2y divided by y, which is equal to 2. And so it's, on one hand, it's a little bit larger than 2. On the other hand, it's going to be a little bit smaller than 3, and therefore the answer is D. And so again, this is sort of a type of solution approach which actually solves the question, but it doesn't go through all of the equation manipulation that the first type of approach did. And these three approaches together are what we call the precise alternative and logical approaches. This is the PAL and algorithm, and this is how we classify different types of answer approaches. And this isn't the topic of the webinar today, but this is important, especially for all of you newcomers, to understand that there are many, many different ways to solve each question, and you really need to focus in on which of the methods you like, which you don't like, and which questions are more amenable to which type of method. Okay, so how do we recommend that you study? How have we built our course? We start off with interactive lessons, and the goal of this is engagement. So I'm guessing many of you have either not done this math for a while, or even if you had, there's a decent chance you didn't like it even when you had to do it. So you need to make it engaging for yourself. So like, for example, when you're studying vocab, then it's not just running down random lists of words, it's trying to make the words alive. It's using mnemonics, putting the words into sentences and so on. And so we use teasers and videos and all this sort of thing in order to make our lessons interactive. We then actually go back into this diagnostic phase, which is what we call it, where we show you the different types of methods for each section. After that, we move on to the improvement phase, and this is another phase that you must go through in your studies. So if the first phase of studying for the GMAT is just learning the material and learning the different approaches, then the feedback, what really helps you to improve, and for retakers, this is especially important, sort of what helps you to break through that glass ceiling, that maximum score that you just can't break through, is this stage. And on the one hand, if you get a question right, then focus in on what made you get that right, sort of what did you do right. If you got it wrong, then focus in on what was your mistake. Were you just silly, which is to say, did you make some sort of small calculation error? Did you miss out on some important detail? Maybe it was an actual fundamental error. Did you not know the material? Should you go back and review the material? And maybe it's a more strategic type of mistake. So it was a question you knew you could solve. You just knew you could solve, and then you wasted 5 minutes on it. And you lost out on 3 other questions as a result. So each type of mistake derives from a different reason. There's a different cause for it. And you need to figure out what the causes for your mistakes are and how to solve them. So when solving questions, do them in batches, say, of 5 to 10, and then take the time to debug the batch of 5 to 10 questions to figure out what you did wrong. All right. And again, this is on our system, we do this automatically. So we sort of do all the heavy lifting for you by gathering statistics both on you and on all of the other students who have answered the question. And we sort of integrate that together in order to give you a recommendation for a specific solution approach. So based on your performance, based on everyone else, what do we think works best for you? So, we do this automatically on our site, but even if you don't want to study with us, then you definitely need to do this on your end. And again, this is just sort of to show a little bit of what we do. There's a statistics behind it. There's a bunch of external recognition and awards, and we have great reviews. Most importantly, specifically for those of you considering working with us, then we do offer a success guarantee, especially for all of you retakers. And you can check out the exact details on the FAQ on our website. I won't get into it now. Okay, cool. So that has been the intro, all right? And again, the goal of the intro was primarily for those of you who are first-time GMAT test takers. It was to explain to you how you should approach the GMAT, what you should think about when you're doing GMAT studying as opposed to general tests. And now we're going to transition into the second part of this webinar, which is its main course, if you will, which is time management on the GMAT. And so before I go into this section, what I would like to ask you is, where do you have time management issues on your GMAT? either for those of you just starting out or for those of you taking the exam again, where are your biggest timing issues? So reading comprehension, where else? I see reading comprehension is a favorite. Okay, does anyone else have problems with anything else other than reading comprehension? Critical reasoning, everything. Okay. Can you be a bit more specific? You know, people who are typing in specific sections or types of questions, that's great. But what specifically is giving you a problem? Is it reading? Is it understanding the time problems? A bunch of different types of problems here. Cool. So that is a lot of really good info. I will get to some of these questions itself. Some of them, please ask me again when we get to the Q&A section at the end. I usually look for questions. But we are definitely going to address quite a few of these questions during the actual. So let's get started. So generally the learning process, and this is a little bit of the recap of the intro that we've done so far. So the stages that you go through when learning, stage number one is just understanding the material. This is learning the basic rules. There's no real, cleverness involved in this part. It's just sitting down, doing the work. If you find yourself asking, means that you need to repeat the stage is if you don't understand something. If you read a concept and you just do not understand what they're asking you is about, remain to understand strength and that means in your learning process is learning how to apply them. So this happens. Oh no. Hmm. Can you hear me now? Is it better now? Let's try again. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I don't. So in learning to apply the material, that is unfortunate. One sec, guys. How about now? How about now? Still no? Yes. Hey, We have a winner. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I have no idea why that happened. Please let me know immediately if it happens again. Okay, so I'll just go one slide back up, and then we can continue going on. Okay, here we go. So the first stage in your learning process is just learning the ropes. It's figuring out what on earth you need to do. The way to figure out if you're still in this stage is if you look at a question and you just figure out you do not understand what you're looking at. So you don't know what a remainder is. You don't know how to strengthen or weaken a statement. You just don't understand how to do the function thing that the question wants you. If any of that happens, go back to your books or to your course or to the videos, to whatever it is, and figure out the actual basic material. The second stage in your learning process is learning how to apply this material. All right. And the characteristic question of this stage is if you find yourself asking yourself, okay, so I mean, I know this has to do with something about the properties of even and odd integers, but I just don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to solve it. I'm looking at this critical reasoning question and I don't understand how I'm supposed to eliminate the types of answers. Okay. And this type of stage is the second stage. It reflects back to the diagnostic stage that we talked about before. And usually, especially if you're doing homeschooling, sort of studying by yourself and not in an active course, then what you want to do is you want to go look for different types of answers to that specific question. For example, if it's an official guide type question, you can find the answers online at GMAT Club usually. And you want to go through all of the different types of solutions available for that question and see which solution clicks for you. All right, this is the second stage. This is learning how to apply the material. The third stage, and honestly, this is the most frustrating of the stages, is the silly mistake stage. This is when you know what you need to do, you know how to do it, but you just do something wrong along the way. And this is, we can devote an entire webinar to this topic actually, but this is not the topic of this webinar. And the final stage, which goes in through all of these, but usually you only have to deal with towards the end, is what this webinar is all about, is just time. So you know what to do, you know how to do it, you just don't have enough time to actually make it happen. And that's what I want to talk about today. All right, so point of fact, actually, I want to start off with a small fun fact, a small anecdote. The issue of timing on the GMAT is so important that the GMAT itself talks about it. GMAT is the company that writes the exam, for those of you who don't know. We were lucky enough to be able to have a full interview with them. You can check it out on our YouTube channel. And basically, one important thing about timing that they said during that webinar is the graph in front of you. And let me just explain what we're looking at. So the orange line is basically they did a statistical analysis of all kinds of students and experiments that they had done with the practice exams and other GMAT things. And they separated between people who answered every single question on the section and people who didn't. And within the people who answered all the questions on the section, what they did is they separated out people who guessed all of the last 4 or 5 questions and people, excuse me, who didn't. So the orange lines talk about people who finished all of the section, which is to say they answered all of the last 4 or 5 questions, not necessarily correctly, but they answered them. And the yellow lines represent people who did not finish the section. So they left 4 to 5 questions blank. And what you can see is that, especially in the higher end of the GMAT, which is, I hope, where most of you are and definitely where all of you want to be, this has a huge, huge impact on your score. So you can see a difference of up to, say, 3 points just for answering or not answering the last 4 questions on the exam. And the take-home message from this specific slide is that you always want to finish your exam. And this is rule number 1 of timing strategies. Rule number 1 of timing strategies is make sure you finish your exam. All right. If you have to guess the last 5 questions and you have 10 seconds left to do on each question, then unfortunately that's what you're going to do. You're not even going to bother reading the question. You're just going to go on and answer all of them. Now, of course, you don't want to get into this position. You don't want to get into the position where you just have 10 seconds left for a question. And this is where the strategies begin. All right, so let's start off with the big picture. The big picture, as you know, is that you have 31 questions in quant at 2 minutes per question, and you have 36 questions in verbal at about 1:50 per question. And this leads to what I assume most of you have already encountered, which is the most basic of the timing strategies. And this is essentially spread out your time evenly. And I can tell you by looking at ESRs from various students, that pretty much always students who manage to spread their time out evenly do better than students who have sections where it takes them 2.5 minutes per question and then sections where it takes them 1:10. They almost always end up with like something around a minute, a bit more, a bit less, but certainly not enough time to answer all of the questions. And their score tanks during the last quarter of the GMAT just because they didn't have enough time. Now, some of you may have heard what is a little bit of a myth, which is that you need to spend more time in the first 5 to 10 questions of the GMAT of each section. This is simply not true. So you should spend a little bit more time, maybe an extra 10% on, say, the first 4 to 5 questions. So if you really, really feel that you need it, you can take another, say, 10 seconds per question on the first 4 to 5 questions, but don't do more than that. You do not want to emphasize on the first section of the exam, because then what happens that even if you do a little bit better on that, you end up not having enough time for everything else, and you end up tanking it. And you can see this in your ESR from many, many different students. All right, so this is basic timing strategy number 1. Which you'll probably hear from every single course or GMAT tutor. But we want to go and leverage a little bit of the information that we have learned from our adaptive AI and from all of the students who have come through us. And that is what the rest of these slides are going to be about. They're going to be based on a statistical analysis of all of our students and all of their performances. All right, and sort of we're going to baby step our way into this. So the first graph that you see before you is a histogram. And what it shows you is the time to answer different questions in seconds. This is the x-axis. In the y-axis, you can see like the little blue bars, and it's normed with like a blue line, is essentially how many questions were answered in a given number of time. Okay, so for example, the average time, which is the average of all of this blue area, is about 118 seconds, which is just about 2 minutes, which is exactly what you expect, which is great. It shows that our questions are well calibrated. There's questions that take you less time, questions that take you more time, but on average, it takes you 2 minutes per question. So this is just a sort of a sanity check. More interesting, however, is that you see that the distribution is not normal. Okay, and what does this mean in plain English? It means that it takes the majority of, or about half of the questions, it takes you less than a minute and a half to solve. And conversely, you only spend or need to spend like a really long amount of time, which is to say 2.5 minutes or more on a quarter of the question. So the majority of the questions you should be solving relatively quickly, less than 2 minutes. Okay, and this is interesting fact number 1. It's that you shouldn't expect to actually solve take 2 minutes per question on each one of the questions. And I guess in verbal, this is especially obvious because like answering that first reading comprehension passage is going to take you much longer than answering the rest of the reading comprehension passages questions. But it's also true for quant as well. All right, and let's get a little bit into the details of what all this stuff means. So first of all, it's interesting to separate between questions that students get right and questions that student gets wrong. And so the question is essentially, sometimes I hear, for example, students saying, well, you know what, I really think I know how to solve this question, but I just need another 20 seconds to do it. I need another 30 seconds to do it. And the usual answer to this question is if you actually know what you're doing, which is to say, if you have a specific calculation that you need to finish, if you just need to check another number or two in order to figure out what to do, then go ahead and do it, even if it takes you another 20 seconds to 30 seconds. But if you're sort of guessing, if you feel that you don't exactly know what you're doing, you're sort of playing around with the question, then usually it's in your best interest to move on. And let me sort of quantify that a little bit. And that's what the next 2 to 3 graphs show. So on this specific graph, the orange distribution shows questions that students get right. The blue distribution shows question that student gets wrong. And you can sort of see visually that the blue distribution is, which is to say the wrong questions, is a little bit to the right of the orange one. And what this means is that you spend longer on questions that you end up getting wrong. A different way to phrase this is that spending more time on question usually isn't in your benefit. All right, usually you don't want to do that. And to sort of really hammer that home, we took the same graph. So this is in a distribution form, but it's really hard to calculate a probability from this. So for example, if you want to know, okay, so I've spent 100 seconds on a question, what is the chance that I'm going to get that question right or wrong? And that is what this next graph shows. And this next graph shows essentially your probability of getting a question right as a function of the time it took you to answer that question. And as you can see, and this is for all questions, this doesn't separate between different kinds of questions, and there are interesting graphs for different kinds of questions as well. But if you were just looking at all of the questions, then you can see that there are people who manage to solve the questions on average sort of very, very quickly, which is to say even before a minute or a minute and a half or so. And in this case, their chances of getting the question right are pretty decent. But the more time you spend on a question, it doesn't actually end up helping you. So once you pass sort of the 2.5 minutes mark, which is sort of the magic number that I mentioned before, then you pretty much have an even chance. You might as well guess, like, because just spending more time on a question that you don't understand, it's not going to help you. You really shouldn't do it. And sort of these are the magic numbers. Okay, these are the magic numbers. We're going to get into a bit more detail and a bit more specifics on what these means in a second. But our magic numbers that we sort of suggest to students on average is that if you've managed to get to a solution or to get to a process like where you just need to finish calculating and you're at a solution within a minute or a minute and a half, then keep on doing it, keep on solving the question, and find out your answer and move on. If you find out that you've passed this mark, that you're sort of a minute and a half into the question, you're still not sure what to do, you're at 2 minutes and you're down to the last two answers and you're sort of debating between yourself which one to choose, and definitely if you're more than that, then most likely spending more time on that specific question will not help you. And you shouldn't do it, and you should skip it and move on. And sort of the take-home message from this slide isn't that you should always try to answer quickly. It's that you should be sort of self-aware. You should be conscious of, are you sure, or do you have a plan for the specific question? Do you know what to do on the specific question or not? And if you don't, if you're looking at a question and you realize you don't know what to do, there's a decent chance that it's not at your level and it's not worth your while to try to solve it. All right, so what else do we have to do? Oh, this note I think I've mentioned a few times. If you're in the middle of calculation, finish up first. So obviously I'm not saying, no, you've gotten to 90 seconds, you need to skip. That's just something that's really important to say. And this next graph actually takes this graph that we're looking at here. So this graph and all the graphs I've shown so far have been about the averages, right? They've been about our average student on the average question. And you might wonder, well, what about an individual student? Or what about me? How do I use this graph? And that's what the next slide aims to show. So what this next graph shows is it's basically the same thing as before. So you have on one axis, the x-axis, the time a student spends on the correct answers. On the y-axis, you have the time that student spends on questions they got wrong. And every single dot is an individual student. And the blue line on the graph is basically the equality. So this means that there are students who it doesn't really matter, but it takes them just about the same amount of time on a question, whether they get it right or wrong. But you see, for the vast majority of students, there's a huge difference. And if we quantify this difference, then I've already mentioned all of that here. If we quantify the difference, then we see that on average, the difference is 20 seconds. So for most of you, there's going to be approximately a 20-second difference between questions that you know what to do with, and you're just on the yellow brick road and you follow down through the calculations or the picking numbers or whatever type of strategy you have choose to use for that questions, and questions when you're sort of wandering around and you don't know what to do, and then you end up getting them more likely than not wrong. Okay, and again, the goal of this specific slide is that you, and sort of this is something that we do, let's call it semi-automatically on our platform, but even if you don't, you need to figure out a way to do it for yourself. It's to figure out your optimal time. So how long do you usually spend on questions that you get correct, as opposed to how long do you spend on questions you get incorrect? And obviously, it's going to be really hard to implement this on the exam in the sense that you're not going to be always looking at your clock. But you do need to develop the internal sensation, the sensation of, I know what I'm doing. I'm on the yellow brick road. I just need to go on, as opposed to I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm just going to guess this, guess that, guess this, guess that, and hopefully I'll get to somewhere. All right, these are very, very different internal sensations, and this is the core, essentially, of the most important timing strategy on the GMAT, which is knowing when to skip and move on, and when to make decisions, which is one of the questions that people asked so far. All right, so we're going to move into an interim summary of sort of the first part of this webinar. And like take home message number one from that, and please keep on typing. People are typing questions in the chat. Please keep on doing it. I might not be able to answer them live, but I will get to them later on. So anyways, the first bullet, the first take home message is that students, on average, and most likely you as well, spend more time when you're wandering around not knowing what to do, and spending this extra time doesn't actually help you. The GMAT questions are all related to a specific concept, except for sometimes the 700 level questions, which are sort of all over the place. But especially, but anything below a 700 level, it's always going to be related to a specific concept. There's going to be a very straightforward way to go about solving it. If you recognize that way, if you can do it, then great, then just do it. If you can't, then there's a good chance that you should move on. All right. And sort of the magic numbers that we put for that are a minute and a half for getting it right, and about 2.5 for just guessing. But find out your own time. And Yeah, that can be spread all over the place. All right, cool. That's been a general sort of approach to time management so far. What we're going to go do now is go through a few specific questions. I'm going to show for these questions a few specific strategies to sort of drive home the main message, which is that different tools can take you different amounts of time. So figure out which tool works best for you. And then I'm going to leave 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, because there were a lot of personal questions at the start, and I'd like to get to them too. So before I go on, let's see. We have a question. Difficult to figure out if a quant question is under 2 minutes type before getting halfway into it. That's actually not true. That is something that you can develop with experience. So sort of at the point that I'm at right now, where I've been teaching this for quite a while, I can look at a question, and based on the question, I can tell you, is this going to be a really hard question? Is this going to be a medium question? Or is it like, let's call it a trivial question where you just have to implement a specific rule? So if you can't figure it out yet, then that is something that you should work on, because it is definitely possible by looking at a question to get sort of an intuition for how much work are you going to have to put into a question in order to understand it. Are there any other midpoint sort of questions? Because this is sort of a midpoint of the webinar, so this is a good point to ask questions about what we've seen so far. So let's see, does this time insight also apply to the verbal section? For critical reasoning and sentence correction, it applies 100%. For reading comprehension, things are a little bit more complicated because most of the time in reading comprehension is going to be spent actually understanding the passage. But in critical reasoning, if your measure for are you able to solve this question is, do you understand the logic of what you're reading? So when you're reading the critical reasoning passage, if you know what it's talking about, if you can see the logical connections and you can think about them, then that's great. If you're reading the critical reasoning passage and you realize you don't understand the logic, that's a very, very big red flag that this is a question above your level. In terms of sentence correction, then again, it's if you can recognize the grammatical rules relatively quickly, sort of what the specific mistakes are by looking at the splits and so on, then that's great. If you find that you're down to the last 2, or hopefully not, but 3 answers, and you're just sort of, going for which one sounds best, then this is a point of don't waste your time. Because just sort of guessing between the last 2 sentences and trying to figure out which sounds better, probably it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if you take 5 seconds for this or 20 seconds, you're just going by gut instinct anyways. Last question for now. Do you offer guessing strategies in exam.pal course? So our main course is built around giving you different types of tools. So which tools do you use and when should you use them? This is sort of the automatic course that is available for everyone, just the course trail. Sort of myself and my other tutors, colleagues are always available for questions. So if you have specific questions, you can just sort of, ask them. And there are, strategies built into the course itself. But for personalized information, you'll need to just ask us on chat and we're always available. All right, is there one last question in this midpoint before we move on? I see someone is typing a question. Yes. What about word type, long info quant questions, timing strategy? So you basically mean really long, confusing word problems. So the strategy that I've found best for students that I've worked with is to break the long word problem down into chunks. So take it and I think actually, no, we're not going to see an example of something like that today. But basically take it, and if, I don't know, it's a question about ratios or something, then or like speed and time and distance, that's a good example. So you see train A is moving at a speed of 5 miles per hour, then you just write down on your scratch pad train A 5 miles per hour. Then it tells you train B 10 miles per hour, you just write that down. So every little bit of information that the question throws your way, you write it down, and then you look at your scratch pad and you look at your summaries. You look at your little bullet point summaries of the question. And that is much, much easier to understand than the very, very long and confusing word sentences that are above you. All right, that's all I'm going to answer for now, because I do want to get on to the second part, and we will have more time for questions later on. Okay, cool. So how can you improve your timing? So answer 1, which I've sort of mentioned a few times throughout, is to know yourself. And this isn't just the hippie statement for the GMAT, it's an actual philosophy. And it specifically boils down to, what does it feel like when I know exactly what to do when I'm on the yellow brick road, as opposed to what does it feel like when I'm stuck? When I'm looking at a question, I'm guessing at it, I don't know how to approach it, I don't know how to solve it, I'm just sort of blanking out. And this directly leads into, at what point should I give up a question and guess? And the answer is what I've said before. So if you know what you're doing, if all you need to do is finish up a certain calculation or whatever, then do it. Otherwise, there's a good case to be made for guessing and moving on. method number two for improving your timing, and this is what the second half of the webinar is going to be about, is building up your GMAT solving toolbox, your cognitive flexibility, which is to say, of the various types of solution approaches out there, and there's quite a few, which ones are you most comfortable using? Which types of questions give you the most difficulty? Which types of traps do you tend to fall into? Which types of things do you forget? Which types of questions maybe do you need to take that extra 10 seconds to verify that you haven't missed, that you haven't made some kind of mistake, because this is a question that's a very tricky question. So all this type of all the answers to these questions are what I like to call tools in your toolbox. They're sort of what you need to do when preparing for the GMAT, after, of course, you've finished learning the basic rules. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go through two example questions. I'm going to show two solutions to these questions. And I hope it's going to be very, very clear that one solution is much, much better than the other. All right, question number one. Of the 900 guests at attending a wedding, 36% were women. If 450 men left the wedding, the women would be what percentage of the remaining guests? All right, and looking at this question, there is a very, very straightforward way to solve it, and that's what we're going to start by doing. All right, so 36% of 900, so 36% of the women out of 900 guests, that would be 36 divided by 100 times 900, counts out 100, 36 times 9. You do a little bit of math. You can sort of simplify it like I've written on the board. You can just do it. 360 minus 36, 324 women at the wedding. Great. But that's unfortunately not what we're actually asked. We're asked if 450 men left the wedding, the woman would be what percentage of the remaining guests? Okay, so now we have to do a bit more math. So let's do a bit more math. 450 men left, so we had 900 minus 450. We had 450 guests remaining. That means that the women out of the remaining guests, 324 divided by 450, which kind of sucks. Now we have to calculate what 324 divided by 450 is. So we can try estimating it, or we can stare at it a bit and sort of brute force it. If you add up the digits, you realize that both of the numbers are multiples of 3. You get 3 times 108, 3 divided by 3 times 150, counts out the 3's, 36 divided by 50, 72 over 100, 72%. And whew, I'm out of breath. I think you probably are too. We have gotten to answer choice D, 72%. Right, and this sort of specific solution approach is something that I want to highlight about the GMAT. And that is that every single question on the GMAT is solvable by a method like this, which is to say every single question on the GMAT can be solved by just putting it into equations and, brute forcing essentially your way through the equations. And, there's different types of equations, different types of questions. And in verbal, again, things look a little bit different. But for every type of question, there is like a precise solution. Unfortunately, sometimes these solutions take a long time. And especially if you're not a very math-oriented person, then this type of method isn't going to be very helpful for you. A different type of method, which in this case what we like to call logical, is what some people are already hinting at in the chat, is that 50% of the men left the wedding. All right, and sort of to recognize this, you need to recognize what the question is talking about. And this question is talking about percentages. It's talking about a change in percentages. And what is a percentage? A percentage is the part over the whole. Okay, and this is just the basic definition of the percentage. But how do you apply this to a question like this? Well, you say, well, okay, well, I mean, the part over the whole, the percentage of women, is the number of women divided by all of the guests. So far, so good, right? That's how we calculated the exact percentage of women before. And what happened? What do we need to do? We need to find out the percentage of the women after the men left. So we know that exactly 450 men left. And this is half of the guests of the wedding. And we know that none of the women left because only 450 men left. So what we have now is we have the same number of women divided by half of the guests. And so this is twice the percentage. And hopefully looking at this and sort of comparing what you have on screen now with all of these calculations that we had on the screen before, I think you'll agree with me that this specific method is much, much faster. And that is actually what the data shows. So this specific question is actually one of the questions in our course. Not everyone's going to see it, but some people do. And looking at the statistics for this question, then people who chose to go a more precise type approach, which is to say just brute force their way through the through all of the calculations, took significantly longer than people who zoomed out and managed to see the big picture. And so this is, again, where I want to go back to the different types of tools available to solve a given question. Because some of you might be going, be sitting out there and saying, okay, I mean, I like this, the solution. It looks really clean. It looks really elegant. But, honestly, I don't think I would have found it. I don't know where you got the intuition for looking at this. I don't see this type of thing when I look at questions. Honestly, I would probably have preferred to just plug in the different answers or go through the equations. And you know what? That's perfect. That's great. I have absolutely no problem with any of those solutions, so long as like they're coming from an honest place of I've actually looked at the different type of approaches. I've tried them out and I've figured out which ones work for me. And hopefully, in trying them out and in learning to use these different type of approaches, you'll be able to shrink the amount of time you're taking on questions. And just sort of to go back to verbal, because a lot of the people were talking earlier about the verbal section. So you can also shrink the amount of time that it takes you to answer verbal questions. And critical reasoning questions are a very, very easy case in point, because the vast majority of our students, they waste time on critical reasoning questions by trying to read and understand every single one of the answers. And that is 100% the wrong way to go about a critical reasoning question. To go through a critical reasoning question quickly, you first need to understand what the passage is about. You need to write down the logical connections between each of the different parts. And you need to think to yourself, what sort of assumption is likely to answer this question, or how would I strengthen this argument if I had to? How would I weaken this argument if I had to? And you need to form in your mind or on your scratch pad like an idea. It doesn't have to be the exact answer, but it's going to be, well, the right answer is probably going to say that dogs eat lots of food. I don't know, maybe it's a passage about pet foods and pets being overweight or something like that. And the right answer needs to strengthen something about dogs and eating food. And once you have this in your mind for example, for that critical reasoning question, then you would go through the answers and you would see which of the answers falls within what you expect to see. And this works for the vast majority, pretty much all of the critical reasoning questions that are like 700 and below. And this really, really reduces the amount of time. All right, so this is an example in verbal for a type of tool which really shortens down the which, when you learn to use it properly, can shorten down the amount of time it takes you to answer that specific question. Okay, let's look at example question number 2. So 2 printers run simultaneously. An inkjet printer that prints at a uniform rate of 80 pages per 15 minutes, and a laser printer that prints 100 pages every 10 minutes. How many minutes will it take for them both to print 230 pages? And once again, sort of the naive type of approach, what we sort of learn to do when we're learning this type of thing in school is to make everything to bring everything to pages per minute. And that's what we're going to do. This is, as you might expect, the slow way, in my opinion, to solve this question, but it's very straightforward. So the first printer is 80 divided by 15, which is 16 divided by 3, 5 1/3 pages per minute. The second printer, we have an easier task ahead of us, so it's just 100 divided by 10, which is 10 pages per minute. And now we have to put those two together. We get 15 1/3 pages per minute. And then we need to figure out what's 230 divided by 15 1/3. And this is, again, where the math is really, really annoying. And, you can go through it. I'm not going to actually bother going through all of this right now, but it's not fun. You get to 15 minutes. All right, so the answer is choice B. Faster way to solve this question, which again relies on sort of a slightly deeper understanding of the concepts at work here, is that ratios can be expanded or they can be reduced. There's actually no reason to ask ourselves what the rate of pages per minute is. What we need to do is we need to find out how quickly the printers work together. So what we should do is we should look for a time frame when both of the printers look for a common time frame, essentially. And so let's just go back up. And so I'll show what I mean. So here our common time frame was a minute, right? We brought down the first printer to 5 1/3 pages per minute. We brought the second printer to 10 pages per minute. So we looked at both printers in a time frame of 1 minute, and then we calculated with that. But there's no reason to bring it down to 1 minute, because instead we can, for example, bring it up to 30 minutes, which is much easier to calculate. So 80 pages in 15 minutes is 160 pages in 30 minutes. And 100 pages in 10 minutes is 300 pages in 30 minutes. And this is a much easier number to calculate. And what this means is that we have 460 pages in 30 minutes, which is also 230 pages in 15 minutes. And again, this is also a precise type of calculation. So we did plug in the numbers into the equations and it did work with them, but we found a much faster way to do it. So if in the previous question, the solution we showed, the different solution approach relied on a fundamentally different strategy to answer the question. It relied on zooming out, understanding something about percentages, something about the question, connecting A to B and figuring out that the answer was in that case 72%. In this case, it relies on the same type of approach, but just on a much, much smarter way to do it. Which is to say, instead of making everything into a common time frame of 1 minute, it's bringing everything to a common time frame of 30 minutes. And this is a different type of, let's call it, timing improvement that you need to adapt to yourself. So even within a specific type of approach, there are faster ways and there are slower ways. For this specific question, let's see what the timings are on our website. We had about 2 minutes for the first type of solution and under 1.5 minutes for people who managed to solve it quickly. And actually, I think one of the users here solved it within maybe 20 seconds or so. User 1-1, I have no idea who that is, but he solved it very quickly. Okay. And I suppose the last part I want to highlight in this type of in this part of the webinar before moving on to the Q&A is that we found that there are many, many different types of questions like this. And we're showing here a sampling of the questions on our website. And all of the dots that are above the line are essentially questions where what we found is that the most common solution approach, which is to say the solution approach that students most frequently use, isn't the fastest solution approach. And what this shows is that this really sort of strengthens the diversity of the approaches that we teach. There are faster and slower methods. They are user dependent, and this is what you should focus on in order to improve your time. And that is those are the main messages from today. So I just want to summarize them, and then we'll go and transition into the Q&A part. I'll answer the question in chat in a second. So main message number 1 from the first part of the webinar. Are you taking longer than usual to solve a question? Then you're probably on the wrong track. You should skip it. You should make your best guess and move on and spend that time on questions that you know what to do with. This isn't just how long on average does it take you to solve a question. This is also your internal sensation. Do I know what I'm doing? Do I not know what I'm doing? Take home message number 2 is to build up your cognitive flexibility, your toolbox. So how many different ways do you know to solve a question? Within a specific way, maybe an equation-oriented way, can you recognize the faster versus the slower methods to solve a given question? And the last one, which is what binds these two together, is to sort of know yourself. Sort of how are you leveraging your strengths? Do you read very quickly? Then maybe the right thing for you to do, for example, in verbal questions is to actually go through all of the answers, read all of them, see which of them make sense if you read very, very quickly. Maybe you're very good at zooming out and seeing the big picture, then maybe you shouldn't jump straight into the calculation. Maybe you should try to think about the question for a bit. Think about what it means for a number to be divisible. I don't know, you're given some x square, which is and told that it's divisible by 3, and asked them what this means about is it even or odd. Maybe you should think about it instead of trying to sort of use specific numbers. Do you know that long word problems give you problems, that you get confused when reading a long word problem? Then don't read through a long word problem. Break it down into little bits. And write down each bit on your scratch pad. And when you have all those little bits and you can look at them as little equations, they're much, much easier to understand and you don't get confused. All right, so all of these together form the big picture of time management on the GMAT. The little picture is, of course, personalized to each and every one of you. I've given a few people a few specific answers during the webinar today. We can go into more personal questions now during the Q&A section. And if you have more questions, then please do come to our website. We are available for chat, which is, again, myself and the other tutors at the company. And, check us out. So the course is, you can set up a free account. And if you like it, then keep going with it. If you don't, then you don't have to. There is a 25% off just for the next 48 hours for those of you with us here today, which is a really, really big bonus. So I do recommend that you try it out just to see the flavor of what we teach and to try to implement it into your own studies. Okay, so moving on to the Q&A, and best of luck to everyone. So let's see. The first question was, what if pages in 30 minutes would not have come? Okay, some more calculations would have been required. And the second question, you're absolutely right. Sometimes more calculations would have been required. The point of that question was to show that it is much easier to get to a common time frame of 30 minutes than to a common time frame of 1 minute. It just makes the math so much easier. And then if you have to do more calculations, then day 2 would have been much, much easier. That was the point of that question. Next question. How to solve bold phase questions in the CR section. So first of all, there are relatively few of these. They're still, around in the OG, but like in all of the practice exams and all students' materials, I've seen them relatively rarely. So you don't need to worry about these types of questions too much. You should spend most of your time worrying about the other types of questions. And when you do get to them, then these types of questions are most often ask you, what is the relation between two parts of a question? So, which is the argument, which is the supporting evidence, so on and so forth. And this really boils down to your ability to understand the logic of the passage. So hopefully during your critical reasoning practice, you've been practicing taking each passage and breaking it down into its logical claims. Sort of, this is a fact, and then this leads to this, and that leads to that. And once you're very comfortable for that, you'll also understand how to solve a boldface question, because it's basically the exact same thing. Once you have the structure for the critical reasoning down, then you just look at your structure, excuse me, and you know what the roles of different parts of the boldface in bold are. Next questions. How many questions can I get wrong in quant for a Q51 score, a perfect quant score? So I don't have an actual number for you because it depends on which questions you get wrong and which questions you get right. The answer is not a lot. I think it's on the order of 2, maybe 3, but it really, really depends. Do you get the hard questions right? If you get the easy questions wrong, then it's probably not going to help you. You need to get all of the easy questions right, and the hard questions, then you can afford to get a very small number of them wrong. So I don't have an exact answer for you, but it's on the order of, let's say, 2 to 3, definitely not more, maybe less, depending on which questions you're talking about. Unfortunately, I missed the first half of your webinar. Is there a way to listen again? Yes, this webinar will be recorded and it should be emailed out to everyone who signed up to it. How many questions in verbal for a V46? So I don't know a V46 off the top of my head, unfortunately. But you check it out online. You'll definitely find discussions about these types of things. Any more questions? There were quite a bit of personal timing issues before. We can talk about that. We can talk about other various GMAT topics, whatever you like for the next few minutes. Do you recommend taking notes for all CR questions? I 100% recommend taking notes during practice. So when you're learning how to solve a CR question, and in general, when you're learning material for the GMAT, it's usually in your best interest to ignore time at the start. So when you just are learning the rules and how to manipulate the algebra, how to break things down and so on and so forth, don't bother about the time, bother about doing it correctly. And so at the start, yes, I recommend to all of my students to take the critical reasoning passage and break it down into bullet points, where bullet point number 1 is A causes B. Bullet point number 2 would be B is important because so-and-so. Bullet point number C is the conclusion is something, something, or something like that. Over time, this will become second nature, more or less, and you won't actually have to write it down. Should you do it on the exam or not is a question of how confused are you when reading the question. If you feel that you just can't hold the whole logic of the question in your mind, then yes, put it down onto paper. That's what the paper's for, and that's also true for word problems, not just for reading, for critical reasoning. Basically, the writing things down is if you can't do it in your head well, if you get confused when trying to do it in your head, then do it on paper. Next question, is 800 possible? Yes, it is possible. I wish you the best of luck. People have done it before. There's a next question. When would I know I'm ready? Do you mean ready for taking the GMAT? Or could you please clarify that question? I'm not sure I understand the question. Next question. I found myself losing on time when writing down info when solving critical reasonings. So again, there's a difference between practicing and the actual exam. So when practicing, when learning more specifically, then yes, write stuff down. When sort of doing, let's call it real practice, so practicing solving things quickly, then it really depends. I do believe that the, let's call it the guiding principle to solving critical reasoning, whether to write things down or not, is how confused you are when trying to understand the question. If you feel you get the logic and can do it in your head, then yes, do it in your head. Especially in the sort of 700 level critical reasoning passages, it's sometimes too hard. And I guess sort of an analogy, if you like, is that in reading comprehension, sort of our recommended strategy is to take the time to understand the passage. So say 2 to 3 minutes to just read and understand, really understand what the passage is about. And then you have, say, a minute at most for each individual question. So you're investing all of your time into understanding, and then you need relatively small amount of time in order to answer the question. Sort of the same type of thing, if not the same numbers, applies to critical reasoning. So take the time to understand the passage, and once you've understood the passage, then go to the answers, and you'll find that they're much, much faster. Okay, I'm doing well on the mocks, but it's the second time I'm writing them. When do I stop prepping and go in for the exam? Oh, okay. So first of all, it depends on where you are as opposed to what score you want to get. So obviously, if you're at the score that you want, then go in and take the exam. In general, I don't actually know if I have a much better question for that. I think that once you feel that your strategies are down, then you should probably take the exam. So once your timing strategies are down, your guessing strategies are down, you know most of the material, sort of you feel comfortable with the different types of questions and so on and so forth, then you're at the phase in your studies when you sort of need to do the real thing. And from then on, you can see how far you are from your target goal. So if you're like only 20 points away, then maybe there's a very decent chance that you'll be able to get it. If you're 150 points away, after all of your strategies down and so on and so forth, then unfortunately there's a good chance that you won't be able to reach your initial goal, and it might be worthwhile to rethink that goal. So the general answer, in my opinion at least, to the question you're asking is once you have your strategies more or less down, then do the real thing. Next question. Do you have any tricks for solving exponents quickly? For actually calculating them? So no. So the types of exponents that you wrote down are look rather horrible. I hope you never have to calculate them. If you see something like that on the exam, like 73rd to the power of 3, then I can almost guarantee that you don't actually need to calculate. Most likely calculating something like 70 to the third, which is much easier, is enough, or maybe even just estimating it as 100 to the third, which is a really, really rough estimate. So that's answer number one. So answer number one is figure out if you actually have to calculate them, or maybe there's something else. Maybe what you need to know is not the actual exponent, but say, is it an odd or even number, or is it divisible by something or another? If you unfortunately do have to calculate exponents, then the best way to do it is to factorize them and then guess. So 73 is annoying to factorize. It might even be prime. I need to think about it for a second. 168 can definitely be factorized into smaller, nicer numbers. And squaring the smaller numbers is much, much easier than squaring the big number. So that's the general trick for doing math quickly. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So do you have any tricks for oh, I just read that one. So I'm getting 710 Q50 V34 in official mocks right now, but I'm aiming 780. Dude, if you're aiming for 780, like honestly, you need perfection. So 710 isn't good enough. If you were at the 750 stage, then I would say just practice, 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 practice. Make sure you get everything right, and then have a perfect, flawless day on the GMAT itself. If you're at the 710 stage, then that means that you're very, very good. But there are still things that you just don't know. Specifically, you have a Q50, so there are specific traps or specific types of esoteric questions that you're not getting. So there are things that aren't sitting perfectly with you. V34 means that there's probably a bunch of stuff to work on, but without knowing the breakdown, I can't help you. Please feel free to reach out on our website for specific advice. As to days and study hours, I really can't answer that without knowing more information. And I think last question for the day, and this is a great question to finish on, is how important are IR and AWA? The answer is not at all. More specifically, you don't want to completely bomb it. So you should aim for, say, at least a 4.0 on the AWA. You should aim for maybe something mid-range on the IR. But honestly, once sort of you've written down a few essays, you get how it works. You've gone through a few practice IR questions, you know what's coming for you, then don't actually practice for it. The vast majority, as far as I know, all admissions programs, there might be a few out there that care about them. Ask your specific program, but as far as I know, all that the admission program really look at with respect to the GMAT is the final score and the quant and verbal. So much more important than practicing the IR and the AWA is making sure your quant and verbal are up to speed. And if they already are up to speed, then put the rest of your time into your applications, into your CV, into your essays, and so on and so forth. Okay, great. I think that's all for today. I hope you've learned something. I hope I've been of help to you. Again, I can't give every single person the best strategy for them because that's just impossible. Every one of you has your own unique strategy. Hopefully, I have been able to give you a general strategic approach in order to build your own personalized strategy. On our course, on our website, we do most of the heavy lifting for you. And so you're welcome to try us out and see if it works. Even if you don't, then please do try to figure out which types of solution approaches work best for you, which do not, and to use this information on your actual exam. All right. Best of luck. We have to end this now, unfortunately. So any further questions, please come onto our website and look for us on chat, and we'll be happy to answer. Bye, and see you later.